right, so here we go. Let's take a look at it this way. First of all, when we're talking about the problem of free will, what exactly are we talking about? Presumably, we're talking about the truth, or the presumed truth, that we are in control of some of our actions. We have chosen freely. What does that mean, though? Well, philosophers have a pretty demanding definition of it. What they mean is this, as you can see on the slide here. I have free will if and only if and only if is always a profoundly strong exclusive conditions apply kind of clause. If and only if I am in charge of, perhaps not all, but at least some of my own actions. In other words, at least some of my choices, perhaps not all, but some, are not entirely determined by causes outside of myself. I'm the final authority that is in control of at least some of my choices, some of my actions. If you believe that is true, you believe in free will. If you do not think that that is true, you do not believe in free will in the sense that philosophers, at least in the Western tradition, have typically understood the term free will. But let's kind of break this down a little bit more. On the question of whether our choices are really and truly free, in the way that the previous slide had tried to establish, you have, I think, two major positions, and a little bit later, a third position. But here are your major positions when do we make free choices. If you believe in free will, again, in the sense that we just went over on the previous slide, if you believe in free will, you are in fact a libertarian, and that's not to be confused with the political theory of libertarianism. More on that in a later lecture. But this just comes from the Latin word libere, for free. And so if you're a libertarian about free will, you believe we do have free will, that is, we do make free choices. And as you can see right here, what you believe in, some philosophers like to call the principle of alternative possibility. In other words, you chose X, but you genuinely, truly, really could have chosen, whatever that means, more on that in a minute, could have chosen something else. That's the libertarian position. That's those who affirm that we do in fact have a free will. Determinism, on the other hand, says, look, we don't make free choices. They deny the principle of alternative possibility. You couldn't have done otherwise. And the principle of determinism basically says, look, everything that happens is 100% the result of prior causes operating outside of the thing in question. And that includes all of our choices, all of our actions, and we're just not free. And these are the two major choices. We'll look at arguments for each of them. There is a third, or maybe even a fourth, but at least a third alternative. But let's play with the idea. So, a couple of visuals to keep in mind as we go forward. Here you see an image of this young lady contemplating her future. Will she go to college? Will she jump right into her career and have that job that she interviewed for? Or will she just stay at home, live with her parents, hang out in the basement, wear pajamas, eat chocolate? I don't know what she'll do. But any of those, if you believe in free will, are genuine possibilities. She could do any of those, or even something else we haven't considered. Some other kind of career move or personal move. So she could do these things. The future is genuinely open. It could go a number of different ways. Unlike the past, which is settled and fixed, and you can't change it. Right? So the past is the past, but the future is genuinely open in various ways. So is the past different from the future? You believe in free will, yeah. The past only went one way. The future could go a number of different ways. If you don't believe in free will, you actually think this picture is misleading, and it's really like this. Right? These other choices this young woman is faced with, college or living with her parents, fiction, right? There's only really one way things are going to go, and you can see it here. The future on this view, though we don't know it yet, still, it's just as fixed, just as determined, just as unchangeable as the past. The only difference is we haven't seen it yet to figure that out. That is the determinist position. The future is as solidly fixed as the past is. Well, which is more accurate, this one or this one? How do we figure that out? Let's start with a thought experiment, and then we'll define terms, and we'll look at arguments, and we'll see what we can come up with. So here's a scenario. You see this individual here. We'll call him Phil. Phil is confronted with a choice. He goes to the cafeteria table at work, and he could choose a nice plate of broccoli or a wonderful chocolate cake. Now let's suppose, which seems most likely to me, he chooses that wonderful piece of chocolate cake, doesn't choose broccoli. Okay, let's just suppose that. Now, imagine I have some kind of recording device. Let's see if I have any. Here we go. We'll pretend this is a remote control. And I push it, and I rewind time. All right, so Phil goes up, and he takes his chocolate cake, and he is getting ready to eat it. And I push rewind, it all goes backward, and we're right back to before he made that choice. And then I hit play. Now, importantly, Phil does not know that I have this power, that I've rewound time, and he's replaying the same events. He has no idea. And so, what will he do? Right? I presume, it seems to me, my intuition is, he'll do the exact same thing. No matter how many times I hit rewind and replay, if nothing changes, he's not aware of anything different, we don't introduce anything different into the choice, I just hit rewind and play, I think he's going to make the same choice every time. That's what my intuition tells me. But if you are a libertarian and you believe in free will, in the robust sense of the term, that you truly believe in free will, you have to think that's wrong. That we don't know what will happen when we hit rewind and then play. Maybe he'll choose the cake, maybe he'll choose the broccoli, maybe neither, maybe he'll get up and dance on the table. I have no idea what it will do if I truly believe in free will. That does seem to run counter to our intuition, but for other reasons, we have strong intuitions in favor of free will. So let's look at that. Here are two main reasons, and they are quite powerful reasons. If not logically, that's up for debate, we'll have to see, at least psychologically. So there are two reasons that we might be absolutely convinced that we have free will. Okay, it feels like we are in control of some of our decisions. So I make a choice, and it certainly seems to me that sometimes those choices are made completely freely. That certainly feels that way. The obvious problem with that is that there are choices that we make where we think we're free when we're really not. If you've ever drunk dialed an X, you have been in this experience, right? You called up the X and the alcohol made you do it, okay, something like that. You felt like you were free at the time. But there are more psychological studies on that make that even more problematic. The problem is sometimes that feeling of control, of freedom, is illusory. And sometimes we think we're free when we're really not. More on that later. But that's the main reason, right? It certainly feels like free will is real. And some of our choices are really ours. Also, we hold people accountable for their actions. We hold ourselves accountable. We hold others accountable, and so on. And that's what we do. We hold people accountable for their actions. Sounds like that's a reasonable way to go about the world. This guy did something terrible, and we want to blame him for it, or I did something terrible and I feel guilt. And that seems to assume that I'm the ultimate authority over what I do, and that implies that free will is true. On the other hand, for many, many years now, going all the way back as far as philosophy goes, and probably back as far as human beings go, many people have denied this common sense notion of freedom, and they are, as I reminded you before, the determinist. And a determinist is someone who says, look, every choice you make, all of our choices, are entirely predetermined by causes outside of ourselves prior to our actions. We couldn't have done otherwise. All cause and effect. This is the basic determinist idea. There's a universal chain of cause and effect. It's just like the row of dominoes. You hit the first one, and every domino falls in sequence. And not only do they fall as they are hit, they fall at the speed they're hit. Everything about the dominoes fall is caused by the prior domino, going back to the beginning of the chain, all the way through to the end. And in fact, the birth of modern physics with good old Isaac Newton sees the whole universe as essentially one big row of dominoes, where you have this constant chain of cause and effect, where the effect is completely dependent upon the cause before it. That's classical physics. So determinists get a great deal of power for their argument from this classical physicist approach, and that's where determinism comes from. You have this argument in your book for determinism, and this is kind of a version of what is also in your book. I'll tell you right now what page that is on, so you can check it on what is in your book. I believe it's in chapter 8, but it could be in chapter 9. I'll have to see. It is in chapter 9. It's on page 110, and written very similarly, but a little bit different. And this gives you a determinist argument and several libertarian responses to try to get rid of it. And let's see how that works. So here are this argument. So if you're a determinist, you argue something like this: if our actions, our choice, which includes our choices, are caused by forces over which we have no control, then we don't act freely. Everything we do is caused by forces over which we have no control, and therefore we never act freely. So it's very simple, and premise one is obviously right. I mean, if everything is caused by forces outside of us, of course we don't have control. But premise 2 is the question, right? Is it really true that everything is caused by forces over which we have no control? And what might those forces be? Well, genetics and environment are the two big factors. Nature and nurture. One might argue that everything I am is just the product of my neurochemistry. In other words, the genes I've inherited and the environment in which I grew up. And that's it. Put me in a different environment, I'm a different guy. Tweak my genes a little bit, I'm a different guy. But given the genes and environment I have, I just am what I am and do what I do. And there's no other way I could be. Okay? So let's think about this. And I'll come back to some of the other arguments in a minute. Let's take a look at your book, chapter 8, actually. The role of genetics on our environment, on the environment, is something that you have to take seriously. Clearly, genetics play a very, very large role in who we are. And we know this. It's a fantastic bit of information. It's on page 105 of your book, from studies of identical twins. And NPR's podcast Hidden Brain, I'll send the link out for it, just did an episode on this in some more detail. It is eerie how similar identical twins are, and not just any old identical twins, but identical twins that were actually separated at birth, so they never knew each other, still had surprising similarities. This research project was begun in the 70s. People still try to gain information of it. And what the researchers found is that identical twins who were raised apart had very eerily similar behaviors. Okay, so here we go. Among those tested were the Giggle sisters, both of whom laughed all the time. Remember, they did not grow up together. They grew up separately, but they were biologically identical twins. Both had the habit of pushing at their noses, which they both called squidging. Both claimed to have weak ankles as a result of falling when they were 15. Both met their husband at dances when they were 16, and both had worked as polling clerks. There were also two brothers named Jim, who drove the same model car and smoked the same brand of cigarettes. Both had elaborate workshops at home where they made miniature furniture as a hobby. Both liked to leave little love notes for their wives lying around the house, and they named their son James Allan, A-L-A-N, and James Allen, A-L-L-A-N. Most remarkable, perhaps, were Jack Youth and Oscar Storr, whose home environments had been exceedingly different. One twin was raised in Trinidad by his Jewish father, the other in Germany by his Nazi grandmother, so yeah, just a little different. Oscar was in the Hitler Youth. Jack served in the Israeli army. When reunited, I have to wonder if they thought well of each other with those different backgrounds, both were wearing rectangular wireframe glasses and blue two-pocket shirts with epaulets. Both had small mustaches. I shudder to think what the Nazi twins' mustache looked like. That's a little disturbing, but going on. Both liked to read magazines from back to front, and both flushed toilets before using them, and one hopes after. Also, both men liked the same odd practical joke of startling people by sneezing in the elevator. Okay, now some of these twin studies probably a little coincident, but there are more, and there are more recent ones, and there are profound similarities between identical twins separated at birth. And this has led many, many researchers to conclude at least 50% of who we are and how we act is completely a factor of our genetics. And you can also see this when you study individuals who are especially violent, which is the next section of your book. There are a number of interesting cases where people have had brain tumors pressing on their amygdala, which shrinks it, which actually makes them more violent. There are famous cases of shooters who've had this, and repeat serial killers. There are all kinds of these. Let's look at a couple of them. Your book wonders, are some people born bad? Okay, so starting with a few sentences down in that section, it's page 106. Humans with head injuries sometimes experience fits of uncontrollable rage. Meanwhile, for people who are naturally prone to violence, so repeat violent offenders, effective treatments include lithium and beta blockers, which act on the brain. The genes neurology violence connection was further confirmed in 1995 when geneticists discovered that turning off the gene responsible for producing nitric oxide, a chemical in the brains of both mice and humans, causes normally sociable mice to become vicious. There's actually a bit of research that backs this up with human beings as well. And that's just genetics. When you factor in environment, think of anyone you know and the different types of people that you know. Think of how much of who they are and what they do is the influence of where they went to school, who their parents were, their religious background, the part of the country they come from, their neighborhood. How much freedom do we really have when so much of what we are and what we do is, point of fact, product of our environment or our genetics? Now maybe we still have free will. But the argument for determinism has to be taken seriously. We better have a good answer for it if we want to claim that we do, in fact, have free will. Here's a couple of other things that should be kept in mind about how much free will we really think we have. Many of our decisions are not made consciously. There is a study, you can take this, you can go to, it's called the Harvard Implicit Association Test. And what the Harvard Implicit Association Test does is you identify different faces to see if you have a bias against women in the workplace, or if you have unconscious stereotypes about African Americans or overweight people. And it turns out virtually everybody who takes this test have these certain unconscious biases. And other experiments have actually revealed that these unconscious biases, and I'll send out some information on this in an announcement after this video, that these unconscious biases, in fact, do affect the way we act. The third one here, you can say, during brain surgery, a person's brain could be manipulated to force them to make a choice. You can actually press or push a part of the brain, and what will happen is the person will make a choice. They'll choose, you give them two colors to choose from, and you push their brain or zap their brain, and you make them choose green, and they think they've really chose it, but the choice is a complete illusion. This is even more telling in split brain patients. In split brain patients, what you find happening is their hemispheres are disconnected. You tell one part of the brain to get up and go out of the room, and then this is the nonverbal part of the brain you usually signal this to with a written instruction. And then you come ask them what they're doing. The other side of the brain doesn't know what they're doing because only the nonverbal side of the brain saw the instruction. And so it makes up a story which they think, again, they've freely chosen. And finally, the middle one here, our brains seem to decide before we are aware of that decision. This is called the Lewitz experiment. I'll send you a video on that in a little bit. But suffice it to say, there are some psychologists and neuroscientists who think that they have demonstrated that all our decisions begin as unconscious ones, meaning our brain makes decisions before we're aware we've made them, and if that's true, how can we possibly be free? This brings me to a point that it would be good to focus on at this point in the course, not only for our discussion today, but also for future discussions, and that is Sigmund Freud. You see his dates there, 1856 to 1939. Sigmund Freud and the unconscious. Well, the unconscious mind is Freud's great discovery. He's not the first person to think of it, but he's the first person to offer a solid theory about it. And Freud, if you ever read his stuff or you hear about his ideas, Sometimes he's brilliant, sometimes he's a cuckoo. It happens to the best of us. He's a little bit of both. Interesting guy, though, whatever else you might think of him. So, all right. What Freud basically theorized, and you've seen this before, is that most of our mental activity is not conscious. Okay, the image of an iceberg is often used. I believe that image goes back to Freud himself. And Freud's basic position is, look, the unconscious makes up at least 90%, probably more, of what's going on. And to the extent that we're completely oblivious to it, we're at its mercy. The unconscious is not rational. It is irrational. And it doesn't decide things the way we would like it to decide things. It's impulsive, it's immediate. And most of what we do is determined by the unconscious mind. And such decisions they're not free. Okay, they're unfree decisions. And this allowed Freud to suggest that the only kind of freedom we can meaningfully talk about, more on this in a few minutes down the road, the only kind of freedom we can meaningfully talk about is conscious freedom. And psychoanalysis is actually designed to draw back those curtains a little bit, bring that iceberg up, and just say, look, if you become a little bit aware of what is ticking inside of you, what's making you do what you do, it no longer has complete power over you. You have some power back. That's what freedom is. Power to do other than your unconscious impulses bid you. You're no longer completely at their mercy. However, if the Libet experiment is correct, and you'll see more about that in a bit, if the Libet experiment is correct that says all our decisions are unconscious, then freedom is completely impossible. But let's go forward. Let's try to make the case for free will. There's a number of different ways to make this case. And again, this is also in your book. I believe, again, in chapter 9. And chapter 8 and 9 are well worth reading. It's an excellent discussion, a set of discussions, really, of everything involved with free will. So do definitely take a look at those chapters. So libertarianism is the view that we are free. And indeterminism is, I suppose, in that sense, a kind of libertarianism, although some would argue it's its own thing. So we'll think about what that means. So if you're an indeterminist, you believe that some of our decisions don't have a cause. Okay, that's a little weird. And what might that even mean, an uncaused decision? Well, here's what it means. It's on page 111 of your book. The little bold thing down at the bottom of page 111. The argument that the universe isn't a deterministic system. So, determinism goes against present-day science. In the heyday of Newtonian physics, the universe was believed to operate according to the strict laws of cause and effect. This is what I spoke about earlier, that the whole universe is a set of dominoes, or if you prefer, a billiard table. Okay. The laws of nature were believed to specify the conditions under which one state of affairs must follow another. The motion of balls on a pool table was a model for the whole universe. But in the 20th century, Newtonian physics was replaced by a theory called quantum mechanics. Now, I'm not a physicist, and neither is Rachel's, so this is not going to be the greatest understanding of that complex theory, but I think it gives enough to discuss how it impacts free will. So, according to quantum mechanics, the laws that govern the behavior of physical matter are not completely predictable, but merely probabilistic. The laws don't say given X, Y must follow, but rather given X, there is a specific probability, 95% or whatever, that Y will follow. For example, suppose that a radioactive substance is decaying. The laws of nature may tell us that a certain percentage of the atoms are likely to decay in the next month. However, the laws won't tell us exactly which atoms will decay. That's left undetermined. So, okay, what's basically going on is this. When you looked at particle physics, you found that particles couldn't be completely predicted, and they behaved in ways that seemed random and arbitrary. So the movement of a particle defied prediction, which didn't fit with this completely deterministic ping-pong billiard table kind of Newtonian physics. Instead, you saw a particle move about in just random ways. The best analogy I can think of is, suppose you saw me walking towards you, and suddenly I was 50 feet to the side. right, mid-step. The particles were behaving something like that. So there's this randomness at the heart of the universe. And if the movement of particles could be unpredictable and random, they can be free. And reading from a quote right in the middle of page 112, you can see it highlighted there, I think. If not, just find it. It says right about halfway down the page, if some things are not determined by the laws of nature, then we might be free because our actions might be among the undetermined things. So it's kind of a messy argument, but the basic idea is if particles can be random and undetermined, our choices could possibly be random and undetermined too, and so maybe they're not determined in the way the determinist wants. I'm not sure that gets you very far, though, as your book says, quite properly, randomness doesn't necessarily mean freedom. Let's go back to Phil with his choice between the broccoli and the chocolate cake. The broccoli and the chocolate cake. All right, well, here's what's going on with that particular problem. What you see in the case of Phil there is a choice. And our question is that choice totally determined or is it random? Remember the rewind and play back. So if I rewind Phil, will he choose the same thing every time? Suppose he doesn't. The indeterminist says you rewind it, he might do something different. But he doesn't have control over that. On the indeterministic view, the choices are random. And if the choices are random, he has no more control over it than if they're determined. Right? It's still a random choice. It's something that happens to Phil, not something Phil does. And it does seem to me that to be a truly free choice, you have to be in control of it. It doesn't matter whether it's determined by a complex interlocked system or whether it zapped you out of nowhere. If you aren't the master of it, you aren't truly free. So I'm not sure this works, which is why we need to look more at what libertarianism says. So traditional libertarianism says basically this. I'll explain Popeye there in the picture in a moment. But some, never all, but some of our decisions are not caused by things outside of us, neither are they random, they're self-caused. I am the cause of my choice. In classical theology, at least classical Christian theology, and I think this is also true of Judaism and Islam, but I'd have to double check. God creates the universe ex nihilo, out of nothing. Right? So God created the universe, and that was a spontaneous and first act. Likewise, all of our choices are ex nihilo, out of nothing. I just created a new chain of cause and effect by using my reason to make a choice. And so basically the idea is there are two types of causes. Event causation and agent causation. So event causation are the dominoes that we saw earlier. X causes Y, Y causes Z, go back to the past forever, go back to the future. This is a one big long chain of cause and effect. Agent causation says that's not true. There are a massive number of causal chains in the universe because every time an agent, which is something kind of like the philosophical concept of a person, someone who's self-aware, self-conscious, in control of their actions through means of their reasoning, every time they make a rationally informed choice, they create a brand new chain of cause and effect. That's possible, but the problem is, of course, I'm not really sure how you prove or disprove that. That seems to be where the problem is. How do I prove this is the case? How do I disprove this is the case? But yeah, I mean, I suppose if we're making a free choice, that explanation is the only way to go. I caused my own choice. That seems the only way to give me the amount of freedom that I want. The question becomes, did I really cause it? Well, we'll have to go back to this slide, why we might not be free. Again, there are some other videos you're going to want to watch. They'll be sent following this video, and see what you think, right? Are we really free or not? There is a third position, and you should know this one. You have determinists and you have libertarians. Your determinists say that you're either free or determined, that's it. And you're not free, so you're determined. Your libertarians say you're either free or determined, and you're not determined, so you're free. The compatibilists want to have their cake and eat it too, unlike poor Phil in our example earlier. What they want to do is they want to say, look, the determinists have it half right. All of our choices are determined. We couldn't do otherwise. So the determinist says, well, then you're not free. But they say, but wait a minute. If we're doing what we want to do, we're free, and therefore we are responsible for our own actions. We're free and we're responsible for our own actions. Okay, fair enough, but what does this exactly mean? It means you could not have chosen differently than you did. If you were going to choose the broccoli, you were going to choose the broccoli, given your genes, your environment, your past history, everything about you. You're going to make the choices you did. But if you chose that broccoli because you wanted to have that broccoli, it doesn't matter that you couldn't have wanted otherwise. You still chose freely because you did what you wanted. In other words, you go all the way back to our original slide. Right? We could have done otherwise. The principle of alternative possibility. Libertarians say to be free, you must be able to have done otherwise. Compatibilists are saying that's not the correct definition of freedom. What they are saying is this. Rather than the freedom being could have done otherwise, freedom just means doing what you want. So you're only not free if you don't do what you want, which you couldn't have done otherwise. Is that really what we mean by freedom? That's a good question. More on that later. Personally, I think probably not. It's at least not what the libertarians seem to mean by freedom. But let's come back to a one final point here, and then we'll sum up. What really is freedom? Let's go back to Freud. Okay. If you look at Freud's theory of the unconscious, Freud thought that what's truly unfree are decisions that we cannot intelligently respond to. In other words, our unconscious or subconscious drives and impulses that make us act the way we do, and we don't understand why. We're kind of at their mercy. It is only through self-analysis, psychoanalysis for Freud, that you can make some of that unconscious conscious and have a degree of freedom. There are political theorists, too, socio-political theorists, who think that you can become more free in a similar sense by having access to information. Right? Can you participate in the democratic process? Do you have a good education? Are you well informed on what truly matters on living a good, happy, and authentic life? And that doesn't really matter if free will in the libertarian sense, as we have it here, is possible. It doesn't take a stance, this notion of freedom. It says basically, look, there's freedom to or freedom from. Freedom to concerns the principle of alternative possibilities. Could you have done otherwise? Could you have done differently? And that's where you get the determinists saying, no, you couldn't have, the compatibilists saying, no, you couldn't have, but you're still free if that's what you wanted to do, and the libertarians saying, you're not free if you couldn't have done otherwise. This view says, I don't know, who knows? But freedom from is extremely important. So, take Freud's special concern, neuroses. If you have psychological compulsions or neuroses or other issues that are compelling you to act in ways that you cannot control, you're not concerned whether you could do otherwise. You want to be free from these compulsions, from these impulses that you're at the mercy of. This is also true. Suppose if you think about a couple of good examples from literature by what we mean of freedom from. So, Frederick Douglass in The Narrative of Life of a Slave, which if you have not read or if you haven't read since high school, reread it. It's one of the most fantastic books ever written. It's extremely difficult and painful to read given the horrible, horrible truths of slavery. But there is a scene when young Frederick, who is 8 years old, is rented out by his master to a family in Baltimore, which is a horrible thing to consider. And what Frederick does is his mistress had not had a slave before, and she didn't know quite how to treat him. And so what she did is she treated him like she treated any other kid, and she liked to teach kids to read, so she taught him his letters, and he was getting to the point where he's beginning to read. The master came in and was furious and said, you can't teach him to read, it'll ruin him, meaning he wouldn't accept his servitude, and he'd learn to think independently for himself. And Frederick, being 8 years old, young Frederick Douglass has this realization that if that guy doesn't want me to read, I'm going to learn to read. Because reading gives me understanding, reading gives me control, reading opens my world, and I'm no longer in mental bondage. Education, reading has freed him. Malcolm X had a very similar experience when he was in prison. Talks about it in the autobiography of Malcolm X. And so freedom from becomes the power of information, the power of learning, the power of understanding, which is similar to the kind of freedom Freud spoke about when the unconscious becomes conscious. And so freedom from is extremely meaningful. I'm not sure about freedom to. I don't know if we really have free will or not. You'll see some videos, you'll read the chapters, and you can decide. But freedom from is at least as interesting, and I think more interesting. Okay,